Hello and welcome. Today you will hear from Mr. Brent Braun, Ms. Asa Coleman, Ms. Carrie Wade, and myself, Ms. Kimball Best, representing the University of Louisville College of Education and Human Development, Educational Leadership, Evaluation, and Organizational Development, second semester doctoral cohort 2023. Oprah Winfrey often speaks of her conversations with the great Maya Angelou, but one conversation had a monumental impact on Oprah. So much so that in her career as a television show host, she repeated the statement that was shared with her to her guests and audiences a total of 42 times. When you know better, you do better. This quote is the essence of action research and specifically feminist theory, Black feminist theory, and queer theory. Today's presentation will bring about a greater understanding about how each of these theoretical frameworks each have their own identities, yet collectively share many of the same attributes, all with the goal of bringing about social change. When you know better, you do better. Action research has the goal of enabling a critical understanding of multiple perspectives. The frameworks that you will hear about today, which are related to race, gender, and sexual orientation, offer insight into the vast number of perspectives that are shown to influence the actions of today's society. The implications of race, gender, and sexuality are present in many challenges that individuals and groups face. Each of these theoretical frameworks works towards inclusion, participation, action, equality, and bringing about social change, all with the end goal of increasing the knowledge of all stakeholders. Through the use of these frameworks, action researchers are able to become an integral part of the work to facilitate social change. This work begins with proposing questions that act as the tools to bring about a better understanding of how inequalities connected to race, gender, and sexuality are found in all aspects of today's society. Each of these frameworks has the potential to create unsettling discoveries during action research. However, knowing that this potential exists increases the necessity of employing these frameworks in action research to bring about societal change. When you know better, you do better.
I'm going to begin by sharing some information with you specific to feminist theory. Feminist theory is defined as an extension of feminism, which essentially is a belief in the equality of the sexes. So you've got a theoretical, sociological, and philosophical approach to each of those. There are several areas, key areas of focus that you're going to hear about in our presentation today. Those include discrimination and exclusion, objectification, power and oppression, structural and economic inequality, gender roles, and stereotypes. So, in reality, feminist theory has always been about viewing the social world in a way that illuminates the forces essentially that create and support inequality, oppression, and injustice. With that said, since the experiences and perspectives of women and girls were historically excluded for years from social theory and social science, which much feminist theory has focused on their interactions and experiences within society, it's important that we understand that there's key components of the world's population that just don't see and understand those social forces, relations, and problems through those particular perspectives. While most feminist theories throughout history have been women, people of all genders can be found working in the discipline today. By shifting the focus of social theory away from the perspectives and experiences of men, feminist theories have created social theories that are more inclusive and creative than those that assume the social actor to always be a man. Part of what makes feminist theory creative and inclusive is that it often considers how systems of power and oppression interact, which is to say that it does not just focus on gendered power and oppression, but on how this might intersect with systemic racism, a hierarchical class system, sexuality, nationality, and ability/disability, among many, many other things. There are 3 waves that we are going to talk about. So we have in the first wave, this essentially was, it took place in the early 19th and 20th century. It was mainly concerned with the women's right to vote, and it ended with the passage of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1919, granting women the right to vote. The second wave took place in the, between the 1960s and the 1980s. And this was mostly focused on issues of equality and discrimination. The second wave slogan was entitled "The Personal is Political," and it identified women's cultural and political inequalities as inextricably linked and encouraged women to understand how their personal lives reflected sexist power struggles. And the third wave that began in the 1990s, it was a response to the perceived failures that occurred within the second wave and the backlash that a lot of the second wave initiatives created. The ideology here sought to understand and to challenge the definition of femininity that grew out of those ideas in the second wave, arguing that essentially the second wave really overemphasized some of the experiences of the upper middle class white woman. The third wave sees women's lives as intersectional, and you're going to hear some information with regard to intersectionality a little bit later in our presentation, demonstrating how race, ethnicity, class, religion, gender, and nationality are all significant factors when discussing feminism. And it examines those issues related to women's lives on an international basis, which was something that had not been reviewed previously.
So under the umbrella of feminism, there are several different types of feminism that we are going to go over. The first one that you'll see on the screen is liberal feminism. And this is a variety of feminism that works within the structure of mainstream society. It integrates women into that structure, and its roots stretch back to the social contract theory of government instituted as far back as the American Revolution. Abigail Adams and Mary Wollstonecraft were there from the start, proposing equality for women. As is often the case with liberals, they slogged along inside the system, getting little done amongst the compromises until some radical movement shows up and pulls those compromises left of center. This is how it operated in the days of the suffragist movement, and again with the emergence of the radical feminist. Leading to radical feminism, this provides the bulwark of theoretical thought in feminism. Radical feminism provides an important foundation for the rest of the feminist flavors. Seen by many as the undesirable element of feminism, radical feminism is actually the breeding ground for many of the ideas arising from feminism. Ideas which get shaped and pounded out in various ways by other, but not all, of the branches of feminism. Radical feminism was the cutting edge of feminist theory from approximately 1967 to 1975. It is no longer as universally accepted as it was then, nor does it provide a foundation for example, cultural feminism. This term refers to the feminist movement that sprung out of the civil rights and peace movements in 1967 and 68. The reason this group gets the radical label is that they view the oppression of women as the most fundamental form of oppression, one that cuts across boundaries of race, culture, and economic class. This is a movement intent on social change, rather revolutionary proportions. That leads us to the next type, Marxist and Socialist feminism. Marxism recognizes that women are oppressed and attributes the oppression to the capitalist private property system. Thus, they insist that the only way to end oppression of women is to overthrow the capitalist system. Socialist feminism is a result of Marxism meeting radical feminism. Geiger and Rothenberg point to significant differences between socialist feminism and Marxism, but for our purposes, we'll be presenting the two together. Eccles offers a description of socialist feminism as a marriage between Marxism and radical feminism, with Marxism the dominant partner. Next, we have cultural feminism. As radical feminism died out as a movement, cultural feminism got rolling. In fact, many of the same people moved from the former to the latter. They carried the name radical feminism with them, and some cultural feminists use that name still. The difference between the two is quite striking. Whereas radical feminism was a movement to transform society, cultural feminism retreated to vanguardism, working instead to build a women's culture. Some of this effort has had some social benefit, such as rape crisis centers. And of course, many cultural feminists have been active in social issues, but not as part of a movement, more as individuals. The last type is ecofeminism. This branch of feminism is much more spiritual than political or theoretical in nature. Its basic tenet is that a patriarchal society will exploit its resources without regard to long-term consequences as a direct result of the attributes fostered in a patriarchal society. Parallels are often drawn between society's treatment of the environment, animals, or resources, and its treatment of women. In resisting patriarchal culture, ecofeminists feel that they are also resisting plundering and destroying the earth, and vice versa.
So the next part of our presentation is going to incorporate some information with regard to feminist theory and intersectionality, and the use within action research, and some critiques of feminism. So with the first component, feminist theory and intersectionality, one of the prominent African-American feminists is Patricia Hill Collins, and you're going to hear from Asa in just a moment. She's going to speak a little bit more to her work. She wrote what was called Black Feminist Thought when she was a professor of sociology, and she explored how Black feminist thought really confronted those injustices of poverty and white supremacy, and argued that those really operating outside of the mainstream were emphasizing those sociological themes based on assumptions different than really what was accepted. And that really brought in the that intersectionality with that critical race theory, and then the queer theory component that Brent's going to talk with you about in just a moment. With regard to the action research component, Patricia McGuire, her work really focused on how feminist theories have and can contribute to action research, while also acknowledging some of the tensions and the conflict that can arise when you're applying and building feminist theories. When she was conducting her work, she did run into quite a few barriers with regard to discrimination, which is not unexpected given the scope and sequence of feminism and perceptions. And specifically, when she was doing her work, the gap really appeared to be linking knowledge to existing theoretical frameworks. So Patricia McGuire really, in her work, she sought to kind of bring everything together to create that bridge through the use of action research, while focused with a feminist approach. One of the texts that she co-authored discussed the tensions, those two tensions that can arise when applying and building feminist theories in action research. Essentially encountering resistance to theory and what they coined the term as the F word, which is feminism, the issues of representation, And that essentially is whose voices get heard and how, when building and applying and acting upon those feminist theories, they're actually put into place. Continuing the journey, this is part of the critique component. It speaks to the participatory action research component. And in this particular research, it was deliberate and used longstanding traditions that used the advocacy approach, so advocating action towards social change, and where it was helping feminist researchers essentially move out of what they considered an academic armchair. So kind of getting out of that academic component and engaging in more transformative research that will better serve women's diverse communities. And now Asa is going to speak with you specific to the Black Feminist Theory component.
Thank you. So to get us started, I'm going to give you all about a minute and a half to review this cartoon. So that kind of puts us in the right frame of mind for why there was a difference and why there was a separation. Okay, so if you read through that and got a sense of hypocrisy, you're probably on the right track. So I will talk a little bit about how those three waves that Carrie mentioned earlier looked slightly different for Black women. It was the same time period, but there was a lot of differences. So during the abolitionist period, you had enslaved Black women during this period, and they had to endure being blamed for their own victimization. They had to battle myths of like the Jezebel and the mammy dichotomy, which added to the need for women's rights and there to be a separation and really more focus on the rights of Black women as well as the rights of all women. So Journal of Truth in the same period did her phenomenal speech called Aren't I a Woman? And that was based on feminism and evangelical principles, which was pretty much like the first time you had an intersection of race and gender. And so, you know, while society and white women were advocating for their rights, Black women were still having to adjust and express how it was still different for them, being half enslaved, and some free women were still not getting equal rights. And so Sojourner Truth really tried to put it in this evangelical framework to kind of push through why this was important and that there were some God-given rights that were being ignored. So then we moved into the women's suffrage when women were fighting for the right to vote. Again, this was still somewhat different for Black women in the sense that feminists were seeking to gain rights, but they were okay with leaving out Black women. And then their attempts to include Black women were either non-existent or were disingenuous. Even in that same time frame, you had Ida B. Wells and women like her and Mary Church Terrell, who created Black women's suffrage groups and were pushing at that point for the right for Black women to vote, and understanding that some of the things that Black women were encountering was because they did not have a ballot. They didn't have access to express their thoughts and feelings. Now, you have a couple of times where it was very prominent, kind of disenfranchisement. And so in 1921, at the National Women's Party Convention, a group of Black women delegates went to talk to the leader of the organization about disenfranchisement. And their point was that Black women were not worse off politically than Black men, which was hypocritical in the sense that white women were trying to separate themselves and push their rights as opposed to white men or in conjunction with white men. So then you move into the women's liberation movement. And this was really a complicated time because it was heavily focus on sexism and chauvinism, as well as sexual discrimination and racism. So all of those put together. So Black women activists were overburdened with the influx of issues affecting them as women and as well as being Black. And so you have like this feminist thought versus in terms of a woman being a feminist versus the ego-stoking girlfriend or the stoic wife or the nurturing mother, and having to battle those titles. And so then here you have like feminist theory suffered from white solipsism. So that's the idea of thinking to imagine and speak as if whiteness described the world. And that's by Adrienne Rich. So there was just a general disconnect between feminism and the fact that Black women felt like their rights were not being addressed, not being represented at all. So you had to kind of pull out this separate group, and it was really exacerbated when feminist group did not rally behind the political persecution of Angela Davis. So that was kind of like the turning point. There were multiple, but this was like the main one that really separated these two groups. So Patricia Hill Collins identified 4 themes that formulate Black feminist thought. 1, Black women empower themselves by creating self-definitions and self-valuations that enable them to establish positive, multiple images to repel negative, controlling representations of Black womanhood. So as I mentioned before, in the abolitionist period, we had to combat the dichotomy between Jezebel and the mammy myths. And so that continued, as a Black woman, it's a matter of, instilling beauty in ourselves and in our community. Black women confront and dismantle the overarching and interlocking structure of domination in terms of race, class, and gender oppression. The Black women intertwine intellectual thought and political activism. And Black women recognize a distinct cultural heritage that gives them the energy and skills to resist and transform daily discrimination. So now we have this piece on intersectionality. So we've already talked about it a few times. We're going to give you another 1.5 minutes, maybe 2 minutes for this one to read through, just to give you an idea of what that really looks like and how you have this separation of which part of me do I ascribe to when I'm trying to fight for my rights. So just take a minute to review this. All right, so I think Brent's going to take us home.
All right. So I'm going to introduce some of the ideas behind queer theory. Queer theory was first coined by Teresa de Lauretis, who was a film theorist. She was presenting actually at a feminist cultural study group, and so she came up with this idea of how as we just looked at with the last slide about intersectionality, what it meant to be both feminine and also queer. It is a combination of post-structuralism and deconstruction, and we'll talk a little bit more about deconstruction and how that factors into queer theory in a little while. Judith Butler, who is a known and strong advocate for feminism, also argued in the realm of queer theory about the performative nature of gender. This is obviously a conversation that over the last several years has become a lot more robust in our understandings of what gender is versus the natural part of the biological aspect of gender. Sorry, about the biological aspect of sex versus what gender is. She did challenge the existing ideas of masculine and feminine. Why do we incorporate those ideas? What are boy toys versus what are girl toys? Those types of ideas that are still obviously very present and prevalent in our conversations today and in the lexicon of what we deal with in the queer community. I included this just as a little graphic of what is included in the alphabet soup of the LGBTQIA community. Again, this is a lexicon, again, that grows all the time. This is something that it's the aim for the LGBTQI community is inclusivity. So making sure that we are involving all peoples and all groups that identify within that umbrella. So what does queer mean? First, as a gay man, I'll say this: queer is one of those words that I balk at times. It's a difficult word. It's one of those words that was thrown around a lot, and it's a word that has become more reclaimed within the gay community. There are three different uses here of the term queer. As an adjective, it's something that's differing in some way. It's eccentric. It's unconventional. As a noun, it is a person, right? So we're looking at a person who is gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, otherwise not heterosexual. It is their person whose gender identity is non-binary. So we have these ideas of genderqueer or transgender or as well, right? And then people who are not either genderqueer or transgender, a person that is cisgendered, right? So we have, those are sort of wrapped up into the ideas of what queer is. And then we have it as a verb, right? It's to consider or interpret something from a perspective that rejects traditional categories of gender and sexuality. And it's to apply ideas from this queer theory, right? So queer is in its essence, the looking at things from another perspective, right? So we're not just looking at things through the lens of sexuality. We're looking at things from the outside. So taking a different perspective. All right, so the focus of queer theory, as I mentioned earlier, is deconstruction. So what is what's the hetero versus homo binary that we operate in? How do we take and strip things away from how we consider the normal, and then how do we then take that and question those things? We're breaking down the dominant narrative, right? So, and why is that narrative dominant? Who allowed that narrative to be the dominant? It is where the rejection of heterosexuality is the norm, and that idea is pervasive in society when we don't even recognize it. I think we see it a lot more now, and because people are willing to talk about it. Because it's not about who is queer, it's about why we are saying they're queer and what about that makes that different, and why is it so important that we identify people as different through our language or through the way that we talk about things. I'm going to wrap up with talking about how I'm going to use queer theory in my upcoming research for my dissertation. I am planning on looking at the way that educators in the queer community are supported in their roles. One of the things in the beginning research that I've been doing is finding ways in which even in 2020 and 2021, obviously, where we see administrators and teachers that feel that they have to remain in the closet because of the heteronormative aspect of education. Education is a very progressive field, but it is a very heteronormative field at the same time. And so what we see is, there are members of the LGBTQI community that refer to their significant others as their friend or their roommate, as opposed to their partner, and not being able to be themselves in the classroom and in their administrative duties because of feeling the pressure of not necessarily being accepted by the faculty or by upper levels. In the GLS-EN research that was done in 2020, there were 73.6% of teachers that faced at least one barrier in engaging in inclusive and supportive practices. And that's remarkable to think that even in this day and age, we see that happen in classrooms. This chart, the external barriers, right? The fact that there are 32.3% of LGBTQ teachers that see the worry of parental backlash and community backlash and unsupportive administration. So this is what my goal is, to look at why are we doing this? What are the supports that we can offer to LGBTQ administrators and teachers as they sort of maneuver this really tricky landscape within a very heteronormative society. All right, and so these are some future readings. We'll link the presentation in the chat after when we're doing our Q&A. And so that way, if you're interested in looking at these, you're more than welcome to look at that. So there's those. And then also what we want to do is we're going to open up the floor in our Q&A session for some discussion. If you have some specific questions about things that we covered, we're going to look at this question. Have you observed or can you make a connection to the social change agents of feminism, Black feminism, and or queer theory in our current society? We want to talk about those things. If you have specific questions about any of our research as it pertains to feminism or Black feminism or queer theory, we'd love to have those questions. And we look forward to engaging in conversation with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.